โมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนะมัสสามิ Blessings to you all. We've come together on the occasion we call Asalaha Puja, the full moon night in July, which is the day we remember the first teaching of the Buddha after his enlightenment. And that's on that occasion the first noble disciple of the Buddha arose in the world, Venerable Kondanya or Ajahn Kondanya. So, important day in the Buddhist calendar, an important reminder of why a Buddha arises in the world, what the duty or the role of a Buddha is. It's to teach the Dhamma so that others can benefit from the teachings and find peace, happiness, experience the end of suffering like the Buddha experienced. Everything the Buddha taught was coming from his own heart, from his own personal experience in the practice. And he taught things that other people can understand. He wasn't just teaching a philosophy or a theoretical sort of analysis of things, although that was part of it. Really, he was just teaching about the way things are, what we call the Dhamma, the truth of the way things are. Because that's what brings us to full understanding and frees our mind from delusion, ignorance that underlies our suffering, frees our mind from the craving and wanting that causes us so much suffering in our lives. Mental suffering, physical suffering, conflicts, anxieties, stress, and all its different forms. Actually, the Buddha, when he first became enlightened, sitting under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya, it wasn't called Bodh Gaya then, but just sitting under the Bodhi tree, he actually considered that maybe it was too difficult to teach people the Dhamma. They're just too wrapped up in their own attachments and delusions, and their own problems and their own lives to awaken to the truth. But at the same time, he'd had a very strong urge to practice not only for his own benefit and freedom from suffering, but also for the freedom of others and happiness of others. That urge was very strong, so it ultimately led him to think, well, who would be able to understand this teaching of the Four Noble Truths that we just chanted in the Dhammachakka Sutra? And he thought of his first meditation teachers, Alama Kalara and Udaka Ramaputra, and then realized, using his psychic ability, that they had actually died, passed away, and entered what we call the Arupa Brahma realms because of their great skill with meditation and developing states of deep samadhi, jhana, Arupa jhana. They were born, you'd say, in a good destination, Brahma realms, but where, as Arupa Brahmas, they don't have the ability to hear or practice the Dhamma. They can just experience the bliss of that realm until they die from it. The karma ends and they're reborn. So then he thought, well, who can I teach then? Who's still alive? And he thought of his 5 students, we call the 5 ascetics, who he'd been practicing with after he left his original meditation teachers. He went to practice with the 5 ascetics practicing what we call dukkha giriya, the painful way, the way of self-mortification. Because in India at that time, the various schools of thought and practice, spiritual practice, religious practice, looking for the way out of suffering. One of the fashionable ones was the way of self-mortification, the painful way that we just chanted, Atakilamatana Yoga, a way that is painful but ultimately pointless. It's kind of punishing the body, disciplining the body, pushing the body to the point where it experiences great hardship. The Buddha tried that for 5 years with his 5 friends and realized at the end it hadn't worked, it hadn't brought him enlightenment, wisdom or full understanding. It brought him great endurance, and he required a lot of special qualities to practice in the way he had. Fasting, holding his breath, going without sleep. He did develop great endurance, but not insight and understanding. So he discarded that way and said it's pointless, it doesn't lead to ultimate realization. The other way he also was aware of, the other sort of direct opposite of Atakilamatana Yoga is Kama Sukhalikana Yoga, attachment to sensuality. So always trying to keep one's 5 senses stimulated and happy with sight, sounds, taste, smell, touch. Always looking to satisfy the senses even though they ultimately can never be satisfied, can never find pleasure and pleasurable experiences that last indefinitely. They all have their lifetime limit, they all have their ending, they're impermanent. So one is forever chasing sensual experience but never finding lasting satisfaction in the world. So both of these ways are based on the body, either harming the body, punishing it, pushing it, or just trying to indulge it, always indulge pleasure. Neither worked as a way to develop true understanding of the way things are, bringing the mind to peace, bringing the mind to the end of endless wanting and dissatisfaction. So that's what had led him to develop the middle way, the Eightfold Noble Path, based on the development of sila, cultivation of sila, morality, samadhi, states of calm, stillness, and then panya, insight, wisdom. And that's what he realized on the night of his enlightenment, and then had the ability to lay it out or present it to others after that. And so he was driven by compassion, having freed his own mind from, you could call it an experience of internal bondage or slavery, being slave to every desire, every attachment, which only brings more confusion, greed, aversion and unhappiness. Having released himself from the causes of his own suffering, he realized this is something other people can benefit from, even though it's difficult. So he thought of his friends and then walked from where he was enlightened 250 kilometers to where they were staying and practicing. And that was the nature of the Buddha's life, walking barefoot around India to teach people and share the knowledge, the Dhamma that he knew, but never forcing it on anyone, simply presenting it and saying, this is the Dhamma, and it's good and it will lead you to real benefit and real happiness, but it's up to you whether you take it up and practice it. But he was confident in the quality of what he was talking about because he had known and experienced peace and happiness for himself. There was no doubt about that. As we just chanted, the unshakable peace of an enlightened mind, there's no doubt left about the practice and what will lead to real, true benefit, true happiness for a human being. So he's confident in the quality of his teachings and what he had to say, but it was something he never forced on others or compelled others to follow or believe in or practice. But he did put great effort, expend great physical and mental effort in sharing what he knew with others out of compassion. So this day of Asalaha Puja, we're celebrating that in the first instance, the enlightenment of the Buddha, and then the compassion of the Buddha to give up the rest of his life every day for the benefit of others, both Sangha, monks and nuns who subsequently started to follow him, and then laity as well, men and women around India, and then up until this day around the world. So all started from that single act of compassion, coming to see his 5 friends. And they were still stuck in their old views, so when they saw him coming, they made an agreement. We're not going to get up and receive him, we're not going to treat him as our teacher because he's already gone the wrong way. They didn't realize he was enlightened yet. They saw him as someone who had given up the way of asceticism, self-mortification, and just taken the easy way and started eating more, sleeping a bit more, resting more, and practicing in a slightly different way. So they turned their back on him, but they couldn't help notice that his radiance and the peaceful presence coming from the Buddha as he walked to the deer park where they're staying, it really got to them. And so perhaps their deeper conviction in the Buddha as a teacher and their determination to practice for the end of suffering meant that they gave up that resistance and quickly humbled themselves and started to treat him very well. And they received him, washed his feet, gave him a seat. And the Buddha gave this teaching, the Dhammachakka Sutra, where he is saying things, I've never said these things before. He'd never claimed enlightenment or full knowledge and understanding, but now he did. And again, he's just setting down this teaching of the Eightfold Noble Path as the way out of suffering to help us recognize craving for what it is and abandon craving. He just set it out and said, well, come and see for yourself. It's the nature of the Dhamma. We call it Ehipasika Dhamma, come and see, or encouraging investigation. It's for you to see, to learn, to practice for yourself. But he wasn't going to force anyone. And even as he taught, only one of the 5 ascetics gained the Dhamma eye, Venerable Ajahn Kondanya, on that occasion. The others still had some small attachments, resistance, confusion in their mind. But very quickly after that teaching, on the first day, Venerable Kondanya became a Sotapanna, stream enterer, and then his other companions on subsequent days also gained the Dhamma eye, became stream enterers, Sotapannas. That's Venerable Wapa, Venerable Bhatia, Mahanama, Venerable Asaji. Venerable Kondanya had made a resolution to be the first enlightened disciple of the Buddha, and that was something that he'd kept to for many lifetimes. So perhaps he was the most intent, listening, following the Buddha's teaching on explaining the Four Noble Truths and bringing those truths into his heart until they became his own insight in the space of one Dhamma talk, and shedding Sakkaya Ditthi, attachment to the self-view, particularly seeing this body as a self, something that we own, control, shedding Vicikicca, doubt about what is the path, what is not the path, Silappata Paramasa, the practice of taking on certain practices but with the wrong view, believing they will automatically or bring one to enlightenment, the end of suffering, but without real investigation of that view and that attachment. So attachment to external practices. He abandoned them all during that talk, and so his mind had clarity, at least on one level, had a glimpse of Nibbana, so like the path to Nibbana opening up. So he was certain this is the way that we'll practice to liberate the mind, although he hadn't fully liberated his mind as he listened. But in only a few days after that, all of them actually did become fully enlightened arahants, the first 5 arahants, enlightened disciples of the Buddha. So this is a significant day for us as followers of the Buddha, because it was the day that Venerable Kondanya proved that these teachings work for other human beings. And the way it takes place is not that the Buddha is transferring the Dhamma in some sort of mysterious ceremony or special kind of transference of this magical power or special power to Venerable Kondanya, but he was teaching him to use his own mind to observe the truth for himself, and particularly to observe that craving or tanha is the cause of suffering, and the way out of suffering is abandoning it, letting go of all wanting, and experiencing the end of wanting, what we call nirodha, cessation of craving. And finally, leading someone through teaching, but then also Venerable Kondanya had to rely on his own abilities, his own development of sila, samadhi and wisdom. He had the right qualities to take that teaching and turn it into his own insight and know, craving does have an end. Craving, attachment does have an end. Have a glimpse of that, even though he hadn't fully abandoned all craving, but he had a glimpse of the end of craving, the end of suffering. This is how the Buddha encouraged us to practice. He never taught us just to believe in him as a teacher, so blindly believe, blindly follow, or blindly believe in the Dhamma. He said, come and see for yourself, investigate for yourself. And if you find what I teach is correct according to your own experience, well then it's appropriate to believe, have the view that it's correct Dhamma, correct teaching. But you have to test it for yourself. So you take these words, the Dhamma teachings, the external words that nowadays we have in audio teachings, books and so on. You take them, but you have to internalize them, bring them in through the practice. And for the next 45 years, that's what he taught. You have to practice for yourself. I can't do it for you, but I can show you the way. And so he's cutting through, they call it the mass of wrong views that were around in society. Even though people had many people meditated already, they had a sense of what craving and attachment was. They had developed states of samadhi. Already people had developed, or some people had developed very far in their practice, but nobody had fully abandoned wrong views yet. But now the Buddha was just bringing that possibility up by explaining the path from start to finish, all the way to Nibbana. So he's showing people you can do this, and Venerable Kondanya proved that on that day. And then the Buddha went off teaching for others and saying, well, look, this is the way it is. If you practice this, you will experience more inner well-being, more happiness, and ultimately you'll experience the end of suffering. But you have to do it for yourself. You can't just take it on trust and say, I believe and that's enough. Belief alone is not enough. The theory, the theoretical teaching, the words are not enough. You have to put them into practice. And perhaps one advantage those 5 ascetics had hearing the first teaching of the Buddha is that they'd already practiced meditation for their whole lives. So they already had very good samadhi and levels of mindfulness, even if they still had some wrong views. Their foundation was very good. They were living in a harmless way, moral way, so they had sila, they had samadhi, they just didn't have full wisdom yet, but they were ready, prepared. So you can imagine Venerable Kondanya listening to that talk. He is following with a mind of full awareness, with mindfulness, clear comprehension, a state of calm, but not so calm that he can't hear the words of the Buddha. He can hear the words, so he's calm. His mind is not bothered by greed, anger, delusion, confusion and stress. He's set that aside because he's been doing that already for many years. But then just following the wisdom of the Buddha, setting out, explaining the Four Noble Truths. What is suffering, and suffering has to be understood. What is the cause of suffering, which has to be abandoned? What is the path that leads you to abandon the cause of suffering? And Nirodha, the cessation of suffering, is something to be realized for yourself. It's not just to be believed in, it's to be realized through the practice. And it can be realized because the Buddha has already done it. And now Venerable Kondanya has that faith in the Buddha and the energy and the willingness, the contentment to practice. He's willing to follow the teacher's logic, first of all the teachings, and then put it into practice for himself and realize, oh yeah, the mind can let go. Particularly he turned his attention to seeing the body, the physical body that we're born with, this human body, is ultimately, it's not a self. It's ultimately something to be let go of. Because the nature of life is that we get born and then we get older and we get sick and then we die. But our number one delusion is we take this body as a self, Sakkaya Ditthi. We take this body as a self. We have a sort of basic innate delusion that this is me, mine, myself, and with that sense of ownership, control. And so we're constantly meeting experiences of pain and suffering because of that delusion. Because we can't control the body. We can't stop it getting older. We can't stop it getting sick. We can't stop it dying. We do our best to look after this body as we're alive, and there's nothing wrong with that. And the Buddha didn't encourage us to neglect our health and well-being, not to take medicine when we're sick, not to feed the body, not to keep it warm when it's cold, and so on. He didn't suggest that. But he said to look more deeply at the nature of a human body. It's made up of the basic elements, building blocks of nature, earth element or solidity, water element, liquidity or cohesion, the water element, the air element, the gas and the air in the body and the oxygen, and then the fire element, temperature, heat and cooling. This body is not, ultimately it's not a self, a lasting self that's under your control. It goes according to causes and conditions. The best we can do is create good enough causes to keep it going, but even then, with the best care, sometimes we get sick, as we know at this time with COVID. With the best care and protection, you might still catch a disease that can kill you. We can still have accidents. And even if you do manage to avoid diseases and accidents and injury, well, just old age gets us all in the end. And you can't stop that with the best diet and the best protection in the world. You can't stop that. Is that realization, ultimately this body is not a self, that changes our view of life, because everything starts with this body and goes out from there. The mind is related and linked to this body. It takes ownership of the body from birth. Consciousness comes into the body at birth. We have this basic understanding that this body is mine, but it's not. So we're constantly experiencing suffering, separation from what we like, being associated with what we don't like. This body has painful experiences sometimes, what we don't like. Even the pleasures we can have with this body don't last. We want them to last, but they don't. We can eat the finest food and experience great pleasure from that, but then we get hungry later. And even the finest food, after a while, gets boring. You can't keep producing the same extreme moods of pleasure coming from tasting that fine food, because after a while you get used to it. Ajahn Chah used to say, if you eat the same pleasant food every day, all day, every day, after a while you can't stand it. And that's the nature of the sensual world that we experience through this body. The pleasure, the happiness, however coarse, however refined, it doesn't last. Because it doesn't last, to take ownership of it is always going to lead to disappointment. Not being able to hold on to what you've got and what you're experiencing, afraid you'll lose it, losing it, wanting to get it back. This is how craving rules our mind, rules our life. And the Buddha was encouraging in that talk and then subsequent teachings for us as human beings to look and observe this experience for ourselves. Right at this very moment, you probably have some craving arising. Maybe you feel tired, or you feel restless physically, or have some pain making you want to move around. Or you might feel cold because it's middle of winter. Or you may have some different external experiences coming up right at this time. Sometimes we have loud noises, or maybe it could be internal suffering of memories of past experiences, memories of painful past experiences. But this is what our body does to us. As long as we attach to it, take it as a self, it keeps bringing us disappointment, dissatisfaction, discontent, which manifests as craving, always wanting something better, something different, wanting to get more, wanting to keep what you've got, afraid you'll lose it, being dissatisfied with some new experience that comes along, then wanting to get back to some better experience or some return to some old pleasant experience. Craving is endless. The Buddha said it's just like the longest river in the world. There's no end to craving unless you start to observe what's going on in your mind. If you just follow craving, you may be able to satisfy yourself temporarily over and over again in life. Nice experiences, pleasant, ecstatic, very refined experiences, but they don't last. So craving keeps falling back to disappointment, disillusionment. The Buddha said, keep watching that, observing that. Because craving is the cause of suffering. Letting go of craving, seeing it as the cause of suffering, letting go of it, abandoning it, is always a revelation to the mind. It's an opening up of the mind to the possibility, I don't have to follow craving to be happy. I can also be happy letting it go. You might say this is the point of this talk from the Buddha. The way to true happiness and peace is abandoning craving, not following it, but recognizing it as the cause of suffering. The way to do that is train the mind in mindfulness, clear seeing, observation of the way things are, learning to watch our own body and mind from moment to moment through our lives. And sometimes we watch and we observe and we still get it wrong. We're still missing something, some aspect of our experience we are not fully comprehending. But sometimes we will experience moments where we abandon some craving and we see this really is the way out of suffering, where you've been beset by some fear or anger or some obsessive greed, and you finally recognize this is craving. The way out of this is letting it go. The only way to do that is develop this ability to watch and observe from a place of awareness, stillness, the mind that is still aware through the practice, to train in that. To develop what Ajahn Chah used to say, the internal witness, the ability just to witness your experience rather than diving in and becoming caught up in craving, but just to witness craving as a true experience, desire, unskillful desire, wanting, not wanting, liking, disliking, observing it, but from a place of detached awareness. And seeing if I keep following craving, it will keep leading me to disappointment, discontent. suffering. If I abandon the craving, then my mind is free from that suffering, doesn't have to experience that suffering. And this is why the Eightfold Path, we're developing all those factors together to bring the mind to a point where it can experience some real peace, stillness, so that it can see clearly what craving is. It's the real source of our suffering as human beings. Until we've stopped and turned our attention inwards to look at our own minds more clearly, see more clearly what is the cause of all our problems in life, we tend to always attribute problems and their causes and all the suffering of the world to external things. So at the moment it's COVID, or it's the government, or it's the vaccine rollout, or it's travel restrictions, or it's not getting the right thing in the shopping mall or the supermarket because of restrictions in the economy, or whatever. We're always looking outside and getting dissatisfied, blaming people and organizations or individuals without observing our own internal craving. So almost you could say that's a huge insight, isn't it, in your practice, when you start turning your attention inwards and saying, oh, the real problem is inside. And the Buddha's proven that, and Venerable Kondanya and others since the time of the Buddha have proven it, because they found, well, even it's not like when you've understood craving and abandoned it, that all the world's problems go away, but your way of relating to them changes. Your understanding changes. You see the real problem is craving on the inside. That's an internal responsibility that we have to accept and start looking at and dealing with. And it won't take away all the problems of the world, but it will take away your personal experience of suffering as you engage and live in the world. So the Enlightenment experience, the Buddha was teaching the path that is a cause for it. He didn't say, once you have developed this path, you won't have to experience any more pain in this body. You won't have to experience the pain of old age. You'll never feel hungry again. You'll never have to deal with difficult people again, or COVID, or whatever else that can bring suffering to humans. He didn't say that. He said, what changes is your mind, the view of the mind, the way it views this body, the mind itself, the world around us. That's what changes. And from there, well, you may actually find you can solve some of the problems in the world in greater or smaller ways, depending on one's skills and knowledge and ability. But you'll only ever be able to do a certain amount for the rest of the world. Even the Buddha admitted he couldn't solve every problem in the world. Some people are not ready to listen. Some people are too deluded, confused to cooperate or understand. So he said, what you can solve and do for the world is solve your own suffering, solve your own craving, your own problem manufacturer. It's another word for craving. It's problem manufacturer of this mind. We create and construct problems through our own wrong thinking, mistaken thinking, attachment to wrong beliefs, wrong views. That much we can do. And that is an offering to the world, because that's exactly what the Buddha did and offered this way of practice back to the world. And for those who are interested, curious, interested to try it out, well, there's great benefit to be had. So the Dhamma is something to be seen internally by understanding this mind and how when craving takes it over, what happens? What is craving is an experience. There's craving for sense objects, as we know, but there's also craving to become. So a lot of our thoughts in line with ambitions and desires for who we want to be, what we see as happiness in this world and how we want to achieve it, tend to be mixed up with craving, and then not getting what we want, not achieving what we want, not getting the things we want, or that goal we have, not getting it, well, that's another form of craving, craving not to become. I don't want this. I don't want a world full of COVID. I don't want to have a body that gives me pain. I don't want to have people who don't like me around. I don't want to have unpleasant experiences in my life, but they happen. So rather than trying to squash out everything and resist everything in the world, the Buddha said, well, try and see, well, if you follow craving, you will keep getting caught into either desire for things, wanting things, or desire to get rid of things. If you can see the end of desire, the end of wanting, then maybe you can find some real peace. So after he taught like this and then carried on teaching for the rest of his life, it's not like the Buddha didn't experience a painful body or hunger or thirst or heat and cold, didn't experience people who didn't like him or even tried to hurt him, harm him, gossip about him. That's not the way he was teaching, to get rid of everything you don't like about the world, squash it, resist it, get it out, protest about it. Because ultimately that's futile, and he realized that. What you can get rid of, though, is the wanting from the mind, the dissatisfaction, the discontent that always comes with craving. Seeing craving is the real problem. Abandoning craving leads to peace. The mind, when it's peaceful, is in its best position to sort out whatever problems we have to deal with. And when your mind is still, clear, wisdom can function at its best. So you might say this day is a day of great happiness for those who have some faith in the Buddha and his teachings, because it's a day we remember that Venerable Kondanya, as someone who proved to the world these teachings work, and from then on, the other 4 friends who lived together, they became enlightened, and then from then on they themselves became teachers of others, and the Buddha carried on teaching. And we say this teaching of the Dhammachakka Sutra is like setting forth the wheel of the Dhamma, setting it in motion, and it's still rolling today. It's still here and available for us to practice today. It hasn't left the world. Venerable Kondanya, after his enlightenment, he was somebody who was actually quite shy. He didn't get enlightened so he could become a great teacher going around. He did teach people, but he actually had a great shyness, they say. He was much older than the other ascetics. He'd been there at the time of the Buddha's birth, and he'd made the prediction that the Buddha, or the Bodhisattva, baby Bodhisattva, would become a Buddha. So he'd kind of followed his life with interest, and perhaps that's one reason why he was so willing to practice what the Buddha taught. But he was older than all the other monks, and other people who became monks and nuns all tended to be younger than him. So he always felt he was a little bit of a kind of burden on the Sangha and kind of in the way. He didn't want to be in the way, have people coming to see him rather than the Buddha, or have to see him first before the Buddha or after the Buddha. So later on he disappeared into the foothills of the Himalayas to stay quietly in the forest, so he wouldn't get in the way of the rest of the Sangha. He was more senior to Venerable Sariputta and Moggallana, who became enlightened after, and they became the leading teachers for the Buddha, leading disciples, leading teachers. But they say when the Sangha came together, they'd always have an empty seat ready for Venerable Kondanya if he ever came back to join the Sangha. They'd have an empty seat just behind Sariputta and Moggallana out of respect for him, because he was the first enlightened disciple of the Buddha. Everyone appreciated that. If you have someone else practicing a Kalyana Mitta, it gives you some inspiration, doesn't it? That's one thing we give each other as we practice. We give each other support, energy. So tonight, it's a night we're practicing late into the night. When you practice doing something difficult, if you see someone else doing it, it helps, doesn't it? If you see someone else meditating, it reminds you to meditate, it reminds you to put effort in. If you see someone else practicing sila, being restrained in their speech and their actions, not giving in to their anger or their greed, not following their craving, gives you the motivation, the inspiration to do it too. Because you see, well, they can do it, I can do it. That's one way that we help each other. Like Venerable Kondanya, you become like a Kalyana Mitta for others who want to practice. We don't always have to be able to give great talks and explanations of the Dhamma. Sometimes the best help is just being one who practices the Dhamma. And the Buddha said this is what brings the Buddha most satisfaction amongst his students, is those who practice the Dhamma. That's the best way of showing your gratitude to the Buddha, and it's the best way to help others, whether you're in the Sangha or in the lay life at home. By putting these teachings into practice, you're helping those around you, even if not a single word is said. Just by following or setting a good example and dedicating yourself to the practice, you're doing great good for the world. Even for those in other worlds. So they say when the Buddha gave this teaching, all the devas gave a great anumodana afterwards. They gave their sadhu, because they realized what a momentous experience it was. And this moving of the Dhamma wheel that was set in motion by this talk, they said a great light arose in the universe. Maybe not everyone could see it, but many of the devas could see it, the light of Dhamma. And we say light arose in the minds of Kondanya and the listeners, but also light arose in the universe. And the light of the enlightened mind, the Buddha's enlightened mind, his wisdom, his compassion, has no limits. It penetrates everywhere. His mind was completely penetrated by wisdom and the end of the experience of Nibbana, the end of suffering. And the light of that penetrates into the darkest recesses and corners of the universe, they say. So all the devas and brahmas delighted and rejoiced at the end of this teaching. So I've given you some words of Dhamma tonight, just words of encouragement in your practice. I'll end the talk here, but in a moment we'll be, for the occasion of Asalaha Puja, we'll be reciting the verses of dedication, and then the monks will do a circumambulation around the hall, and you can join in chanting Iti Piso and holding flowers and candles at home if you're watching.